He went to prison for a crime he didn't commit. 15 years later, he came home and killed the two people who put him there. In the quiet suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, Derek Monroe was known as the kind of man every mother wanted her daughter to marry. 33 years old, soft-spoken, a mechanical engineer by trade, and the type of guy who still opened car doors and said, "Yes, ma'am," to elders. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't even raise his voice. He went to work, paid the bills, mowed the lawn on Saturdays, and made breakfast for his wife every Sunday. His wife, Tasha Monroe, was 3 years younger and just as well regarded in the community. She worked at a local hospital as an administrative assistant, smart, confident, always dressed like she was going to church, even on weekdays. Together, they were what people called picture perfect. But like most pictures, you only saw what was in the frame. Behind closed doors, their marriage was changing. At first, it was little things. Tasha stopped laughing at Derek's corny jokes. She started going out with her girlfriends more, staying late after work. Derek, on the other hand, was working overtime to save for a down payment on their first home. They lived in a modest apartment just outside the city. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Or at least, that's what Derek thought. He never suspected another man. Not because he was naive, but because he loved her that deeply, trusted her that blindly. But something shifted when David Harper entered the picture. David was a new hire at Tasha's hospital, a traveling nurse with model looks, a smooth voice, and the kind of charm that made people lean in when he talked. Tasha mentioned him once or twice, nothing more than passing comments. "David's a clown," she said once, "always flirting with the nurses." But that's the thing about casual mentions. They're often anything but. What Derek didn't know was that while he worked extra shifts, skipped lunch to meet deadlines, and fell asleep exhausted on the couch most nights, Tasha and David were meeting in the parking lot behind the clinic. It started as flirtation, then rides home, then hotel rooms with names that didn't ask questions. And one day, Tasha made a decision that would alter Derek's life forever. It happened on a rainy Thursday night. Derek had come home early for once, carrying Chinese takeout in one hand and a bouquet of sunflowers, Tasha's favorite, in the other. He unlocked the door, humming some old 90s R&B song, expecting to surprise her. But she wasn't surprised. She was furious. Tasha stood in the living room with wild eyes and a torn shirt, screaming at him to get away and "don't touch me." Within minutes, police sirens echoed through the complex. Someone had already called 911. Derek stood there stunned as officers burst in, guns drawn, screaming commands. He was cuffed, shoved against the wall, and read his rights, all while Tasha sobbed in the background, pointing at him and shaking. "He attacked me," she told the officers. "He tried to force himself on me when I said I wanted to leave. No bruises, no signs of struggle, no witnesses, just her word." But sometimes a word is all it takes to destroy a life. Derek sat in that cold interrogation room for hours, refusing a lawyer, because in his mind, this was all a big misunderstanding, a mistake, a nightmare he'd wake up from. But the nightmare didn't end. Instead, it got worse. At trial, Tasha testified under oath that Derek had assaulted her in their home when she told him she was leaving. Her voice cracked. Tears rolled down her cheeks. She played the victim with an Oscar-worthy performance, and the jury believed every word. A hospital doctor claimed to have seen emotional trauma and possible signs of forced contact. Nothing conclusive, but paired with Tasha's testimony and a biased prosecutor looking to make headlines, it was enough. The verdict came in swift and cold. Guilty. 25 years in prison without parole. Derek didn't cry. He didn't shout. He just looked at Tasha, his wife, the woman he'd built his life around, and whispered, "Why?" She didn't answer. She just turned away. In the back of the courtroom, Derek's mother wept so hard she could barely breathe. His younger brother tried to hold her up, but grief made her legs weak. And Tasha? She walked out with David Harper, holding her hand like they just finished Sunday brunch. Outside the courthouse, no one saw Derek again for a very long time. He was just another inmate, just another case. But what no one knew was that this wasn't the end of Derek's story. It was only the beginning. They say prison changes a man, but what they don't say is how much more a lie can do. Derek Monroe entered Fulton County Correctional as inmate number 84329, but to the men inside, he wasn't just a number. He was a wife raper, a title worse than murderer, worse than thief. It was a scarlet letter carved deep into his skin, and no one cared whether he was innocent or not. The guards didn't believe him. His cellmates didn't believe him. Even he began to question if maybe he had done something wrong without realizing it. The first few months were hell. Inmates spat on him. They stole his food, trashed his bunk, and whispered threats as he walked by. One night, 3 men cornered him in the showers. The guards turned a blind eye. He ended up in the infirmary with 2 broken ribs and a stitched-up eye. They called it justice. But the pain didn't end in the infirmary. That was just the beginning. The weeks that followed blurred into one long, sleepless haze. Derek's ribs ached with every breath. His eye stayed swollen shut for nearly 2 weeks. And even when the wounds faded, the looks didn't. The whispers didn't. The label didn't. Wife raper, they hissed when he passed. Coward. Punk. The guards barely did their jobs. Some laughed when inmates hurled trays of food at him. Others let his bunkmates steal his toiletries, rip his sheets, even piss in his locker. It was all part of the unofficial welcome. And every time he thought about fighting back, he remembered the way the judge's gavel sounded. Final, brutal. He had no power. None. He began to eat less, sleep less, speak less. On the 26th night, Derek stood on the edge of his bunk, staring at the metal vent above. He had torn his bedsheet into strips, one part tied to the bedpost, the other looped around his hand. He wasn't sure what scared him more, the idea of dying or waking up again tomorrow. That's when he heard the voice. "Don't be stupid, son." The sound came from the next bunk over. An older man with skin like creased paper and eyes that looked like they'd seen 5 lifetimes. "Go ahead and hang yourself if you want," the old man said, voice low and slow, "but do it after I finish this game of chess. Ain't nothing worse than dying during a checkmate." Derek blinked, slowly lowered the strip from his hand. The man's name was Leon Gramps White, 72 years old, in for something no one ever talked about, but everyone respected him for. He had a limp, a missing tooth, and a mind sharper than broken glass. For whatever reason, Gramps took a liking to Derek. "Something in your eyes," he said one day over lunch. "You still got light in you." That's dangerous in a place like this. Over the next few months, Gramps became a guide, not just through the twisted politics of prison life, who to avoid, which guards were decent, how to hide commissary so it wouldn't get jacked, but through survival of the soul. He handed Derek books from the library. Philosophy, law, spiritual essays, books about men who'd been locked up and still found ways to write, to speak, to matter. "You ain't got to believe in God," Gramps said, "but you better believe in something, or this place will strip you clean." They talked for hours some nights, Derek sitting cross-legged on the cold floor, listening to Gramps tell stories from the civil rights era, from his time as a janitor in Selma, from a year he spent in solitary for punching a warden. "Pain don't scare me," he'd said. "Silence does." Gramps became the first person in years Derek actually trusted. And then, like everything good in his life, it was gone. It happened on a Sunday morning. Derek had just come back from kitchen duty and found Gramps slumped over in his bunk, lips blue, a worn Bible still clutched in his hands. "Heart failure," they said. "No ceremony. No goodbye." just a sheet over his body and a gurney down the hallway. That night, Derek sat on the floor beside Gramps' empty bunk and cried for the first time since the arrest. Not because Gramps was gone, but because he was the only one who saw Derek as more than his case file. Later that week, one of the younger guards dropped off a small box at Derek's cell. "He left this for you," the guard said with a half nod. Inside was a cheap chessboard, a folded letter that read, "Keep thinking 3 moves ahead, and don't ever let them teach you how to be less human." And at the bottom of the box, a broken pocket watch, the glass cracked, the hands forever stuck at 11:32. Derek kept it with him from that day forward. Sometimes in the quietest parts of the night, he'd wind it anyway, just to hear it tick. It didn't matter that it never told the right time. It reminded him that time still meant something. That maybe, just maybe, he could still outlive the lie. But even after all that, Derek didn't break. Not because he was strong. He wasn't. He just refused to believe that this was where his story was supposed to end. Back home, the world moved on without him. Tasha filed for divorce 2 months after the verdict. She kept their shared car, emptied their joint account, and sold off most of Derek's belongings. She even posted a long message on Facebook, painting herself as a survivor of domestic abuse. The comments poured in. "You're so brave, Tasha. He never looked right to me. Thank God you got out." Meanwhile, Derek's mother stopped answering the phone. Not because she didn't care, because she couldn't bear to hear her son cry. Her health declined rapidly, and by year 4, she passed away in her sleep. Derek wasn't even allowed to attend the funeral. He found out through a cold, typed letter from the Department of Corrections. He sat on his bunk for hours, holding the letter like it was glass. It was the only piece of her he had left. And in that moment, something inside him changed. He started keeping a journal. At first, it was just a way to get the rage out. He wrote down every memory he had of Tasha. The good ones, the bad ones, the lies. Then he wrote to his mother, page after page that she would never read. But slowly, that journal became his anchor. He started documenting everything: his days, conversations, court transcripts, even legal codes. And that's when he noticed something. In one of the original police reports, there was a brief note. Tasha refused a full medical exam. He hadn't remembered seeing that before. Why would a victim refuse that kind of evidence? He requested access to more documents. Some were denied, others heavily redacted. But a pattern was beginning to form, and it didn't sit right. Then, in year 13, something unexpected happened. A new inmate, Curtis Ray, moved into the unit. Curtis was a loudmouth, always bragging about women, money, and things he clearly never had. But one night, after too many commissary hooch drinks, Curtis said something that froze Derek's blood. "You ever hear about that chick at North Atlanta Hospital? Tasha something? Had this crazy scheme with her side. Dude framed her husband for rape just to get rid of him. Genius SH*T. Derek's heart nearly stopped. "What did you say?" he asked, voice trembling. Curtis laughed. "Oh, you ain't heard? Man, it was slick. Buddy of mine used to work maintenance there. Said she and this nurse boyfriend cooked up the whole thing. Said she showed up with fake scratches and everything." Derek didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he requested a legal consult. He reached out to the Innocence Initiative, a nonprofit that helped the wrongfully convicted. They'd already rejected him once before, citing lack of evidence. But this time, he had something different. He gave him names, timelines, inconsistencies. He turned over his journal, 5 thick notebooks of details, doubts, and contradictions. He even managed to convince Curtis to give a written statement, though it cost him every dollar in his commissary. And this time they listened. Over the next year and a half, investigators dug deeper into Tasha's original claims. They discovered that David Harper had a history of sexual misconduct at a previous hospital, sealed in a quiet settlement. They found messages between Tasha and a friend hinting that she was planning to finally be free soon. Even worse, they found a voicemail, long buried in a police archive, where Tasha told her mother, "It's the only way. If he goes away, I can finally have the life I want." That was enough. On June 7th, year 15, Derek Monroe walked out of prison. No confetti, no cameras, just a brown paper bag with his belongings, a bus voucher, and a letter that said, "Your conviction has been vacated." He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just stood outside the prison gates, breathing air that felt too light for a man who had carried 15 years of silence. And yet freedom didn't feel like freedom. Because even though he was no longer behind bars, his soul was still trapped in that courtroom, in that bedroom, in that moment when the woman he loved turned him into a monster with a single lie. 15 years is long enough to forget how soft a mattress feels. Long enough to forget what silence sounds like. Long enough to bury who you used to be. When Derek Monroe walked out of Fulton County Correctional, he wasn't the man who went in. The system had chewed him up and spit him out, skin darker from years under prison lights, hair thinner, shoulders heavier. His voice was quieter now. Every word filtered through suspicion. He didn't smile. He didn't joke. He didn't trust. He couldn't. They gave him a bus voucher and $80 in state reentry funds. He used it to rent a room in a halfway house just outside Decatur. It was small, humid, and smelled like mold and cigarettes. But it had a door he could close from the inside. That alone felt like luxury. He got a job at a scrapyard within 2 weeks, thanks to a supervisor who believed in second chances. The work was brutal, long hours, heavy lifting, loud machines, but Derek liked it that way. Physical pain was simple, predictable, not like betrayal. He barely spoke to anyone. The other men at the halfway house called him Ghost. He didn't argue. The nickname fit. Every morning, he rose before sunrise, made instant coffee, wrote in his journal, then walked 2 miles to work. At night, he sat on his cot with headphones on, listening to jazz, old R&B, or sometimes just static. Anything but silence. But no matter what he did, the memories always came back. Tasha's face on the witness stand. The look in her eyes when she pointed at him and said, "He did it." David Harper's smug grin the day of sentencing, sitting behind her like a trophy. Those moments played in Derek's head like a movie stuck on loop. He wrote them out, again and again, trying to drain the poison from his system. It never worked. Then came the moment that shattered whatever fragments of peace he'd managed to build. It was a Saturday afternoon. The scrapyard had closed early due to a rainstorm. Derek decided to walk to a nearby grocery store. He didn't like being inside when the sky roared like that. Too much like prison lockdown. He turned the corner toward the frozen food aisle and froze. There, less than 10 feet away, was Tasha. Older now, softer around the face, hair dyed auburn, wearing yoga pants and a casual jacket. She looked normal, like someone's PDA mom, like someone who hadn't ruined a man's life. Beside her stood David Harper, holding a shopping basket, leaning in to whisper something that made her giggle. And between them was a little boy, no older than 7, clutching a toy car. A boy with Derek's eyes. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His ears rang, his vision blurred. The weight of 15 years crushed his chest in an instant. And they didn't even notice him. They just walked past, laughing like he didn't exist, like he had never existed. Derek stumbled out of the store. He vomited behind a dumpster and then sat in the rain for over an hour. He didn't go home that night. He walked and walked for miles. When he finally returned to the halfway house, his boots were soaked, his fingers numb, and something inside him had cracked. That night, he pulled out his journal and started a new entry. But this time, it wasn't a letter to his mother. It wasn't a record of the day. It was a question. What do you do when justice fails? He didn't have an answer. Over the next few weeks, Derek became someone else. He stopped going to group meetings, stopped responding to texts from his caseworker. He took longer walks after work, always circling past the grocery store, the neighborhood where Tasha lived. He followed her once, kept a block away. Watched her drop the boy off at school. Watched David kiss her on the porch. Watched them live the life he was supposed to have. He started documenting their schedule. Morning routines, gym visits, grocery days, even the security camera angles near their house. It wasn't obsession. It was focus. Each page in his journal grew darker. Not just in tone, literally darker. He pressed harder with his pen. The words bled through. The letters scratched into the paper like wounds. He stopped dreaming. Or maybe he was always dreaming, and this was the nightmare. One evening, Derek sat alone at a diner near the bus stop. An older woman sat at the next booth and struck up small talk. "You look like you got the weight of the world on your back, baby," she said gently. Derek forced a polite smile. "You have no idea." She offered a simple reply. "Whatever it is, don't let it make you someone you're not." That line stayed with him the rest of the night. But he knew deep down that man was already gone. In year 16 of his life sentence, the one outside prison, Derek came to a silent, irreversible conclusion. The justice system had failed him. The courts had failed him. She had failed him. So, if no one else was going to make it right, he would. Derek Monroe had always believed himself to be a good man. Even after 15 years in prison, even after losing his mother, his freedom, his future, he still clung to some fragile thread of dignity, some part of himself that whispered, "You're better than them." But that thread had frayed. Now it was gone, and in its place, a quiet, calculated fury. Each morning, Derek woke up before the sun and wrote. But these weren't journal entries anymore. These were plans, the dates, the routines, the exits, the blind spots in the neighborhood cameras. He wasn't just watching Tasha and David anymore. He was mapping them. Every Tuesday, they dropped the boy off at martial arts class at 6 p.m. sharp. At 6:10, they stopped at the same coffee shop on Westfield. At 6:45, they were back in their SUV, driving home through a narrow street with no streetlights. It was predictable, efficient, just like prison taught him to be. But the rage wasn't in the planning. It was in the details. Watching David open the car door for Tasha. Watching Tasha bend down and kiss the boy on the cheek. Watching them laugh like nothing had ever happened. Like they hadn't destroyed a man. Like they hadn't stolen his life, his name, his child. Yes, that boy was his. There was no denying it now. Same eyes, same walk, same dimple on the left cheek. And yet, Derek was a stranger to him. A ghost walking in daylight. Derek couldn't stop thinking about the boy. Every night, long after the scrapyard closed and the halfway house lights dimmed, he sat on the edge of his cot replaying the same scene. Tasha and David walking down the grocery aisle, and that child, the child that had his eyes, his dimple, his hesitation in stepping. He started walking by the boys' school. Not to stalk, not to threaten, just to see. Every Tuesday morning, he sat on a park bench across the street from Monroe Elementary, hidden behind a copy of the local paper. At 7:53 a.m., like clockwork, the SUV would pull up. Tasha in the driver's seat, David in the passenger. The boy would hop out, backpack bouncing, always holding something, sometimes a toy, sometimes a small notebook, once a plastic dinosaur with a missing tail. Derek began to write everything down. Not just routines, but moments. The way the boy paused before crossing the sidewalk, how he always waved at the crossing guard with both hands, how his laugh sounded like bells wrapped in wind. One morning, Derek brought a small box with him. Inside, a Matchbox car, the exact model of the one the boy had dropped outside the store 2 weeks prior. Derek had gone back that night, picked it up from under the cart return, cleaned the dirt off with a toothbrush, and kept it. He didn't know why. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe longing. Maybe it was just the first thing he'd touched that made him feel like a father. He slipped the box under the school's outer fence, wrapped in tissue, with a note written in block letters. For the boy with the toy car. From someone who remembers. He never knew if the boy got it. No one mentioned it. But 2 days later, the same toy car was clipped to the boy's backpack strap. Derek nearly broke. That night, he pulled out an old notebook and wrote a letter. Dear son, you don't know me. You're not supposed to. They took that from us. But I see you. I see how careful you are, how curious. I see the part of me they couldn't erase. And maybe that's enough. He didn't sign it, didn't mail it. He carried it in his coat pocket for days, waiting for the right moment. One Friday, he followed them to a public playground. Tasha sat on a bench, scrolling her phone. David talked loudly on a call. The boy played alone, zooming the toy car down the slide, laughing to himself. Derek stood behind a tree 20 feet away, letter in hand, heart beating like a war drum. Then the boy turned, just briefly. Their eyes met, and something flickered in both of them. Recognition? Instinct? Echo? Derek almost stepped forward. Almost. But the moment passed. The boy looked away. Tasha called him back to the car. And just like that, the connection dissolved. Derek didn't cry, didn't shout. He walked home that evening slower than usual, like every step pulled pieces of him further apart. He tore the letter into tiny pieces and let them drift into a storm drain. That was the night he stopped hoping. The night he stopped calling the child his son in his journal. From then on, he just called him the boy, because it hurt less that way. One night, back at the halfway house, Derek sat in the dim common room, watching a news report about a man who killed his boss after being fired unjustly. The anchorwoman called him a coward, a monster, a man who snapped. Derek turned the volume down and whispered to himself. Sometimes monsters are made. He started keeping one of his old journals in his coat pocket. Not for writing. He barely wrote anymore. It was to remind himself of who he had been. On the inside cover, there was a faded photo. Tasha and Derek, taken 10 years before her betrayal. She was laughing. He was holding her from behind. They looked young, real, in love. It was a lie, but it was the last memory he had before the fall. The turning point came one Thursday evening. Derek had followed them to a small diner off Memorial Drive. He sat in his car across the street, engine off, eyes locked on the window. Inside, Tasha and David sat across from each other in a booth, eating burgers and sharing fries like two teenagers. The boy sat beside them, drawing on a napkin with a crayon. Then Tasha reached across the table and placed her hand on David's cheek. Just a soft, intimate gesture, innocent to anyone watching. But to Derek it was gasoline. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. His breath grew shallow. His jaw clenched so tight it ached. In that moment, he wasn't just angry. He was humiliated. Publicly, privately, universally. They had replaced him. And no one, not the courts, not the world, had ever held them accountable. That night, Derek walked 10 miles home. He didn't say a word, didn't look up. When he arrived at the halfway house, he went to the shared kitchen, boiled water, and made a single cup of black coffee. Then he sat on his bed, took out a fresh sheet of paper, and began to write slow, deliberate strokes. To whom it may concern, it was a confession of everything, of what they did, what he planned to do, and why. But he didn't stop there. He packed a small duffel bag with two things: a change of clothes and the last letter his mother ever wrote to him. In it, she said, "No matter what they say, I know who you are. Don't ever lose yourself trying to survive." He read that line 3 times, then folded the letter carefully and placed it in his coat. On Friday, Derek didn't go to work. He took the day to walk the route one last time. He passed the school, the store, the house with the red mailbox. He stopped at the park where the boy sometimes played and sat on a bench. He watched a father push his daughter on a swing. listened to the wind rustling the leaves. And for just a second, he imagined a life that could have been. The life they took. That night, he stood outside their home at 9:42 p.m. The lights were still on. The SUV was in the driveway. The blinds in the living room were half open. He could see them, David on the couch, Tasha pouring wine in the kitchen. Just like that, within reach. So vulnerable, so unaware. He reached into his coat. His fingers brushed the cool metal of the knife. But they also touched something else, the photo, the journal, the letter. His mind split in two. Justice or peace? Vengeance or silence? But the truth was, for men like Derek, there was never peace. Only the illusion of it. October 12th, 9:47 p.m. The street was quiet. Just the occasional chirp of a night bird and the distant hum of a neighbor's television bleeding through paper-thin walls. Derek Monroe stood in the shadows across the street from the house he once imagined raising children in, a house he never got to call home. His breath fogged in the autumn air. The knife in his pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, but not heavier than the years they had stolen from him. The lights were still on. He could see movement through the window, Tasha laughing, leaning against the kitchen counter, sipping from a wine glass. David Harper on the couch, watching a basketball game, feet propped up like the king of a life he didn't deserve. Derek crossed the street slowly. Every step felt like it echoed into eternity. He didn't run. He didn't creep. He walked. With purpose. With pain. When he reached the front porch, he hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of memory. There was once a version of this night he'd imagined. Him walking up the porch with flowers, a boy running out yelling, "Daddy!" Tasha smiling in the doorway. But that future never came. And now he stood here, a ghost of the man she destroyed. He rang the doorbell. Once. Then again. Inside, a muffled voice. "Who is it?" Silence. Then, "Hello." The door opened, and there stood David Harper, confused, holding a half-eaten bag of chips, eyes narrowing in recognition. Derek didn't speak. He moved. In a single motion, he pushed the door wide and lunged. The knife drove deep into David's stomach. David gasped, stumbled backward, tried to yell. But Derek pressed forward, hand over his mouth, twisting the blade. Years of pain, betrayal, and silence surged through his arm like lightning. Tasha screamed from the kitchen. Glass shattered. A wine bottle crashed to the floor. David, oh my God. She turned the corner, barefoot, wide-eyed, shaking. Then she saw him. Not the man she once married. Not the quiet husband who made her pancakes on Sundays. But the man she created. Blood on his hands. Eyes hollow. Heart gone. Tasha stumbled back, fell to the floor, crawling toward the hallway. Please, Derek, don't do this. He didn't run to her. He walked, step by step, slow, controlled. Like every second was sacred. Like this moment had lived in him for 15 years. She backed into a corner, hands raised, sobbing. Her voice cracked. We were kids. I didn't know. I didn't mean for it to go that far. Derek stopped 3 feet away. He didn't lift the knife. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small audio recorder. Say it, he said quietly. Tasha froze. Say what? She whispered. You know what? Say what you did. Say it, and maybe I walk away. She stared at him, trembling. Then, through the tears, she nodded. The confession came like a dam breaking. I lied, she whispered. I lied to the police. You never touched me. You never hurt me. I just wanted to leave. And David said it was the only way. He told me we could be together, and that no one would believe you if I cried hard enough. Her voice cracked again. I was selfish. I was scared. I never thought they'd actually give you 25 years. I didn't think you'd survive. Derek clicked the recorder off. Silence. Tasha sobbed in the corner, repeating, "I'm sorry," over and over, like some kind of broken mantra. Derek stood still for a moment, just looking at her. Then he knelt down, their faces inches apart. He whispered, "You buried me alive. This is mercy." Then he stood, turned the knife in his hand, and drove it into her chest. One strike, deep, precise. She gasped, eyes wide, then nothing. The room was still. Only the ticking of a kitchen clock dared to speak. Derek looked at the bodies, two people who had stolen everything from him, and felt nothing. No relief, no peace, no victory, just a cold void. He walked into the living room and sat on the couch, the same one David had been lounging on minutes before. He picked up the remote and muted the TV. The final score flickered across the screen. Lakers lost by 2. Derek chuckled softly. Figures. 15 minutes later, he dialed 911. "Emergency services, what's your emergency?" "My name is Derek Monroe," he said calmly. "I just killed my ex-wife and her partner. I'll wait here for you." When police arrived, Derek was sitting on the porch, arms outstretched, knife placed carefully on the step beside him, palms up. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. At the station, one of the detectives, a younger guy with kind eyes, asked softly, "Why'd you do it, Derek?" He looked up and said something that would echo long after. Because the truth didn't matter until someone bled. The courtroom was smaller this time. No media frenzy. No protesters outside. No one screaming for justice. Because this time, everyone knew what he did. And this time, he didn't deny it. Derek Monroe sat quietly at the defense table, wearing an ill-fitting beige jumpsuit with inmate stamped across the back in block letters. His wrists were shackled to his waist. His eyes fixed on nothing. Not the judge. Not the jury. Not even the floor. Just somewhere far beyond the walls. The prosecution didn't need to work hard. 2 victims. A bloody crime scene. A recorded confession. And a full admission. Their argument was simple. This was premeditated double homicide. No matter the history, no matter the pain, this was murder. His public defender, a weary man named Charles Dalton, did what he could. He told the jury about the wrongful conviction, about the 15 years stolen from Derek, about the trauma, the grief, the psychiatric scars. But the law doesn't bend for broken men. Tasha's sister testified on day 2. She brought a photo of Tasha holding her son on his 6th birthday. Cake, balloons, bright blue icing. She cried on the stand. "She didn't deserve this," she said. "I don't care what happened years ago. This wasn't justice. This was revenge." And Derek? He didn't speak. Not until the judge asked if he had any final words before sentencing. He stood, cleared his throat, and said, "They buried me, and no one dug. I try to live with it. I really did. But every day I walked around dead while they got to live. Laugh. I never asked for revenge. I just wanted to be heard. And no one listens until the blood hits the floor." The courtroom went still. Even the judge didn't look him in the eye. The sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The bailiff turned Derek around, led him down the hallway, past the rows of wooden benches and out of the courtroom. He didn't look back. There was no one in the gallery for him anyway. Back at the facility, Hancock State Prison this time, they put Derek in a medium security wing for inmates with no disciplinary history. He was quiet, kept to himself, never caused trouble. The guards liked him, called him old school. The younger inmates avoided him, not out of fear but respect. There was something in his eyes that said, "I've already seen hell. Don't try me." He spent his days working in the library. He didn't read novels. He read law books, prison reform history, cases of wrongful convictions. He started writing letters for other inmates, petitions, appeals, statements of innocence. He wrote like a man trying to atone. But at night, it was different, because night was when the ghosts came back. Tasha's voice, his mother's laugh, The sound of the cell door slamming behind him, echoing not just in the air, but in his bones. He kept a new journal, too, but now his words were slower, wiser, heavier. On the first page, he wrote, "I got my truth, but I lost my soul to get it." 3 years in, Derek was diagnosed with hypertension and stage 2 kidney disease. The doctor said it wasn't uncommon for former inmates, especially those who lived under stress that long. He shrugged. "I was dead before I ever got here." Every year, on the anniversary of his release from the first sentence, he sat outside in the prison yard at exactly 11:32 a.m. Didn't talk, didn't move, just sat. No one asked why, but the guard started calling it Derek Day. In year 5 of his second sentence, he received a letter from the Innocence Initiative. They just won a multi-million-dollar settlement for another man who was wrongfully imprisoned. They offered to reopen Derek's civil case for compensation. He didn't respond, not because he didn't care, but because what he wanted could never be bought. Sometimes when new guards came in, they'd look at his file and ask, "You really did 15 years for something you didn't do, and still ended up back here for murder?" Derek would smile sadly and say, "Yeah, crazy, right?" Almost like no one ever paid attention to what happened in the middle. On his 56th birthday, an inmate asked if he ever regretted it. The killings, the silence, the surrender. Derek took a long breath and said, "Regret doesn't undo pain, and peace don't visit men like me. I made a choice. Not a good one, not a bad one, just the last one I had left." That night, he sat at the metal desk in his cell and opened the last page of his journal. He wrote, "They told me prison changes you, but no one told me that sometimes prison is the only place you can finally tell the truth. And sometimes truth costs blood." In the final years of his life, Derek Monroe became a ghost even behind bars. He spoke less, slept less, ate just enough to stay breathing. But he wrote, every night, by the dim yellow light in his cell, on the same cheap-lined notebook paper with the same black gel pen. He never ran out of words. His hair turned gray before 60. His hands, once strong from lifting scrap metal and prison weights, began to tremble when holding a spoon. His blood pressure remained high, and his kidneys were failing steadily. The prison clinic said he'd qualify for dialysis. He declined. "I'm done being kept alive by machines," he muttered. "They already kept me alive in a cage." No one argued. By then, Derek had become a figure of quiet reverence in Hancock State Prison. The younger inmates called him Mr. D. Some came to him for advice. Others just wanted to sit in silence. He never gave lectures. He asked questions. What would you do if no one believed your truth? What if forgiveness isn't for them, but for you? What are you willing to lose to feel whole? Most of them didn't have answers. Neither did he. One day, a young inmate named Caleb knocked softly on his cell bars. He was barely 20 and on a 15-year sentence for armed robbery. "Mr. D," he said, "you ever think maybe if you'd just let it go, you'd still be free?" Derek didn't look up. He kept his eyes on the page in front of him and whispered, "Freedom ain't a place, son. It's a feeling. And some of us, we never get to feel it." Caleb sat down on the floor beside the bars and didn't say anything else for the next hour. Just sat. In year 11 of his second sentence, Derek collapsed in the prison yard. No drama. No sounds. He just sat down on the bench one afternoon and didn't get back up. A passing CO found him slumped, hands still resting on a notebook in his lap. The first responders tried CPR, did what they were trained to do, but it was over before it began. Time of death, 2:14 p.m. Age, 61. His body lay in the infirmary for 2 days. No one came forward to claim it. No next of kin. No old friends. No community waiting with flowers. Just silence. The prison chaplain offered a small memorial. It was held in the prison library, Derek's favorite place. 7 inmates attended. 2 guards, and 1 woman from the Innocence Initiative who had once handled his civil case, but had never met him in person. They each said something short. The woman from Innocence read from one of his letters. Justice is a language only the punished truly speak, and some of us were fluent before we ever entered a courtroom. She paused, then added quietly, "He didn't die for revenge. He died because the world gave him no other way to survive." Derek's belongings were few. A worn Bible, 3 notebooks, a photo of his mother, 1 cassette recorder, still working, and a final letter addressed to anyone who still believes the system works. Inside, he wrote, "Don't wait for people to believe your pain. Don't let silence eat your truth. And if you must scream, scream loud enough that history remembers your name." After his cremation, the warden allowed a portion of Derek's ashes to be buried beneath a maple tree in the prison yard. A quiet spot, shaded, wind always moving. They placed a small stone at the base, engraved with words chosen by the inmates themselves. Derek Monroe, 1970 to 2031. He told the truth. The world wasn't ready. Months later, Caleb, the young inmate who once sat outside Derek's cell, earned early release for good behavior. He carried with him Derek's final journal, wrapped in a cloth, tucked in a paper bag. He moved to Savannah, got a job detailing cars, volunteered at a legal aid clinic on weekends, and every time someone asked him why, he'd smile and say, "Because a man once told me truth don't die in silence. It dies when we stop passing it on." If the world were fair, Derek Monroe would have never gone to prison. He would have kissed his wife goodnight every evening, tucked his son into bed, and gone to work the next morning just like every decent man should. He would have grown old with someone who loved him. He would have walked his child to school. He would have lived a life filled with boring little moments, the kind most people take for granted. But that's not how his story was written, and it's not how it ended. Years after Derek's death, his final journals were quietly published in a book titled Stolen Years, Stolen Peace, The Derek Monroe Letters. It wasn't a bestseller. It didn't win awards. But it found its way into prisons, libraries, classrooms, and courtrooms across the country. In one of the early pages, he wrote, "They say forgiveness is freedom. But what if the people you're supposed to forgive are still smiling while you're choking on the dirt they've buried you under?" The words hit hard, because they weren't just poetry. They were truth carved from suffering. A professor at Howard University made the book part of his criminal justice ethics syllabus. A prison reform activist in Chicago quoted it during a televised panel. A documentary filmmaker included Derek's story in a short film titled The Cost of a Lie. Bit by bit, his name returned to the world. Not as a murderer, not even as a victim, but as a warning. One day, the boy, Tasha, and Derek's son, now 21, walked into a community center in Atlanta. He didn't come for a class. He came to see a mural. It was painted by a former inmate, depicting a man sitting beneath a tree with his head bowed and a journal on his lap. The caption read, "Some men die twice. Once when they're sentenced, again when the world forgets them." The young man stood there for a long time. He didn't cry, but he stayed, because deep down, he had always wondered about the man no one talked about, the one whose name his mother erased, the one who looked back at him every time he passed a mirror. And though he never said it out loud, he knew. Years later, that same young man, his name was Micah, changed his last name from Harper to Monroe, not out of guilt, not out of grief, but out of respect. He didn't speak often about his parents, but when people asked, he'd say, "My real father didn't die a killer. He died telling the truth no one else had the courage to listen to." Micah didn't grow up hearing the name Derek Monroe. To him, it was just a line on his birth certificate, blurred, crossed out, silenced. His mother never talked about the trial, never mentioned the man she once married. David Harper had been dad as long as he could remember. A man who coached his soccer games, grilled burgers on Saturdays, and kissed his mom's cheek in the kitchen like nothing had ever happened. But even as a child, Micah had questions. Why were there no baby photos of him and Derek? Why did his mother's eyes darken whenever he asked about her first husband? Why did a man's name feel like a ghost hovering just beyond reach? After Tasha and David's deaths, the questions only grew louder. Micah was 12 when he was told they were gone, that some man named Derek Monroe had killed them. At the time, the story was simple. A jealous ex-husband, a deranged criminal, a man unworthy of sympathy. But in high school, Micah stumbled across something that unraveled everything. He was in the school library, researching wrongful conviction cases for a social studies paper, when he saw the name. Derek Monroe. It was in a journal excerpt, Stolen Years, Stolen Peace, the Derek Monroe letters. He froze. His breath caught. His heartbeat thundered. He checked the book out and read it in secret, cover to cover. By the final page, he was shaking. That night, he confronted his aunt, Tasha's sister, and demanded the truth. She broke down and told him everything. The lie, the trial, the confession, the murder, the silence. Micah didn't speak for days, and when he finally did, it was only one sentence. He was my father, and I never knew him. For months afterward, he wrestled with the weight of that truth. He'd been taught to hate a man who had, in many ways, saved him by refusing to let the lie define who he was. Micah read the letters again, then the trial transcripts, then the book again. By the time he turned 20, he'd made a decision. He filed the paperwork quietly. No announcement, no Facebook post, just a trip to the county office with his ID and his signature. He changed his last name from Micah Harper to Micah Monroe, not out of guilt, not out of some performative penance, but because it was his name, because it belonged to the part of him no one had protected. Now, when people asked why he chose to carry the name of a convicted killer, he didn't argue. He simply said, because not all killers are monsters, and not all monsters use weapons. He kept the final journal in a fireproof box beneath his bed. Sometimes he would read it aloud to groups at community events. Young men try to get back on their feet, college students studying criminal justice, survivors of the system who had lost their voices. And each time, he ended with the same passage. They buried me, and no one dug. I walked around dead while they laughed. And when I finally screamed, it was too late. So now I write, because maybe someone else will hear. Micah made sure someone did, because he believed what his father wrote in one of the final pages. Maybe I was born for pain, but my son will live for something better. Some stories leave behind a legacy of justice. Others, a legacy of pain. Derek Monroe's story left both. In 2035, a law was passed in Georgia requiring a second layer of review in all sexual assault cases where the accused had a prior clean record and the accuser was a spouse. It was nicknamed the Monroe Clause. Activists pushed for more, better access to post-conviction appeals, mandatory forensic testing, penalties for false testimony. And though the fight was uphill, Derek's name gave it weight, because even in death, his voice refused to stay silent. And yet in all that came after, the laws, the books, the change, there remained a quiet, aching truth. It should have never come to this. Derek Monroe should not have died behind bars. Tasha should not have lied to save herself. David Harper should not have manipulated a woman into betrayal. And most of all, a system designed to protect justice should never have ignored the possibility of error. But it did, and it still does. In the final paragraph of Derek's last journal, he wrote, I don't want people to remember me as angry. I want them to remember I tried. I tried to live right. I tried to heal. And when that failed, I tried to leave something behind that meant something. If you're reading this, Please, for the love of everything still good in this world, listen to the quiet ones, to the broken ones, to the ones who scream without ever raising their voice. Derek Monroe died alone, but his truth did not. It echoes now in prison halls, courtrooms, and hearts across America. And maybe that's the most anyone can hope for. Not to be a hero, not even to be remembered, but to make sure that the next man who tells the truth doesn't have to bleed for it.